The first thing I noticed that evening wasn't the laughter, or the music, or even the smell of roasted rosemary chicken drifting from the kitchen. It was the silence. A strange, sharp silence that cut through everything else like a thin crack in glass. My name is Victoria, and I've always believed that homes remember things. Mine certainly did. 32 years of birthdays, arguments, reconciliations, and quiet Sunday mornings lived in those walls. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every draft near the windows, every echo of voices long gone. That night, the house felt different. Full but not warm. I adjusted the silver tray in my hands, balancing 3 glasses of wine and a small bowl of olives as I made my way from the dining room toward the hallway. My son Daniel had insisted on hosting this year's family gathering at my place. More space, he said. Strange how easily something that belonged to you could begin to feel borrowed. Mom, careful. Daniel called out from across the room, not even looking up from his phone. I've carried heavier things than this, I replied lightly. That was true in more ways than he realized. At 62, my hands weren't as steady as they once were, and my knees complained on colder days, but I wasn't fragile. Not even close. Still, I noticed the way people had started speaking around me lately, slower, softer, as if I were something that might break. I turned into the hallway, heading toward the kitchen. That's when I heard them. I'm telling you, I can't do this much longer. I stopped. It was Elena, my daughter-in-law. Her voice was low, but tense. Controlled, the way people sound when they're trying not to be overheard. I know, another voice replied, her friend Melissa. But what's the plan? My heart tightened for reasons I couldn't yet explain. I've been looking into options, Elena continued. Places that are comfortable, not those depressing ones. Somewhere she'll be taken care of. A pause. Then, quieter. She doesn't have to stay here forever. The tray suddenly felt heavier. I stood frozen, just out of sight, my breath shallow. Melissa spoke again. And Daniel? Elena gave a small, bitter laugh. He won't say it, but he agrees. He's just too soft to act. Something inside me shifted. Not broke, shifted. Like a lock clicking open. She forgets things, Elena continued. Leaves stuff around, repeats herself. It's only going to get worse. We need to be realistic. I pressed my fingers harder against the tray. Forgetful? Because I misplaced my glasses last week? Or because I asked twice about dinner plans? Is that what I had become to them? A problem with a timeline? And the house? Melissa asked. There it was. The real question. Elena didn't answer right away. But when she did, her voice changed, softer, but sharper. Well, Daniel is her only child. Silence. Then, it would solve a lot of things for us. I felt the words land like cold water down my spine. Not concern, not care. Convenience. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make a sound. My body moved on instinct, retreating before my mind had time to catch up. I returned to the dining room with the same steady pace, placing the tray down on the table as if nothing had happened. Everything okay, Mom? Daniel asked. I looked at him. Really looked. The boy I had raised alone after his father died. The one whose nightmares I soothed, whose school lunches I packed, whose future I built piece by piece. Now a man who couldn't meet my eyes for more than 2 seconds. Of course, I said with a gentle smile. Why wouldn't it be? Dinner continued like a performance. Plates clinked, glasses filled and emptied. Conversations overlapped. Laughter rose and fell. And I played my role perfectly. I nodded at the right moments, smiled when expected, even laughed once or twice. But inside, something was reorganizing itself. Quietly, carefully, I began to notice things. The way Elena corrected me when I told a story, subtly but often. The way Daniel stepped in to help me with simple tasks I'd done my entire life. The way decisions about my own house were discussed as if I were adjacent to them. Not central. Not necessary. Later that evening, as guests began drifting toward the living room for dessert, Elena approached me. "Victoria," she said warmly, placing a hand on my arm. "You should sit down. You've done enough today." Her touch was light, but it lingered just a second too long. "I'm not tired," I replied. "You don't have to push yourself," she insisted. "We're here to help." Help. Such a generous word. Such a dangerous one.
I smilte her.
"I know," I said. And for the first time that night, I meant something entirely different. After everyone left, the house fell into a deep, echoing quiet. I stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the sink full of dishes. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. Not older, not weaker, just clearer. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the table, wrapping my hands around the warmth. So this was their plan. Not sudden, not emotional, strategic, gradual, almost polite. They would help me. They would suggest changes. They would worry about me, until one day I would no longer be asked, only informed. And if I resisted,
Well,
there were always ways to make someone seem incapable. I closed my eyes and let the truth settle. Then I opened them again and made a decision. They thought I was fading, that time was quietly taking me apart, that I wouldn't notice, that I wouldn't fight. They were wrong, very wrong, because I wasn't afraid of losing things. I had lost my husband at 48. I had rebuilt my life from silence once before, and, if necessary, I would do it again. But this time, I wouldn't just survive. I would prepare. I stood up slowly, rinsed my cup, and turned off the kitchen light. The house returned to darkness. But for the first time that night, I felt in control of it again, and of what would happen next. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully risen, and for a few quiet seconds I lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of my house settling into the day. The refrigerator hummed softly, the pipes clicked somewhere behind the walls, and outside, a distant car passed by. Ordinary sounds, comforting sounds. But something inside me had shifted overnight. I wasn't waking up as the same woman who had gone to bed. The softness, the automatic trust, the quiet habit of putting everyone else first, it hadn't disappeared, but it had been pushed aside by something sharper, clearer. Awareness. I didn't cry. That surprised me more than anything. I thought I would. I thought the betrayal would hit me like a wave and pull me under. But instead, what I felt was focus. I got up, dressed carefully, not in my usual comfortable house clothes, but in something more structured, something that reminded me of who I used to be before life narrowed into routines and responsibilities. A navy blouse, pressed slacks, a pair of earrings I hadn't worn in years. When I caught my reflection in the mirror, I paused. There she was. Not old, not fragile, just underestimated. Good, I murmured to myself, because underestimation can be useful. I made my coffee slowly, deliberately, as if nothing had changed, but in my mind I was already mapping everything out. Conversations, patterns, weak points. If Elena and Daniel were planning something, it wasn't impulsive. It meant they'd been thinking about it for a while. That meant there were steps. And if there were steps, there would be traces. By 9 o'clock, I was out the door. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I drove across town to a small office building I hadn't visited in years. The sign outside had changed, the paint fresher, the landscaping neater, but the structure was the same. Solid. reliable. Inside worked someone who had known me long before I became just Daniel's mother. Her name was Margaret Ellis. We weren't best friends, but we had history, real history. We met when our husbands were both alive, when life still felt like something expanding instead of something narrowing. She had gone on to build a legal career specializing in estate planning. I had stayed busy raising a family, managing a home, surviving what came after. Now it seemed our paths needed to cross again. When I walked into her office, she looked up, and for a split second, surprise flickered across her face before it settled into something warmer. "Victoria," she said, standing up. "Well, this is unexpected." "I suppose it is," I replied with a small smile. "Do you have time for me?" "For you? Always." We sat down, and for a moment, I considered how much to say. Not because I doubted her, but because saying it out loud would make it real. But then I remembered the hallway, the whispers, and I didn't hesitate anymore. "They're planning to move me out of my own house," I said calmly. Margaret didn't interrupt. That's what I always appreciated about her. She listened fully before reacting. So I told her everything. The conversation I overheard, the subtle behaviors, the shift in tone, the quiet positioning of me as someone who needed help whether I asked for it or not. By the time I finished, the room felt heavier. Margaret leaned back slightly, her expression no longer warm, but sharp. "How long do you think this has been going on?" she asked. "Longer than I realized," I admitted. She nodded slowly. "That's usually how it works. No drama.
No shock.
Just confirmation." "And legally?" I asked. "What could they do?" That's when her tone changed, not softer, but more precise. "If they wanted to push this," she said, "they could start building a case that you're unable to manage your own affairs. It doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual. Documentation. Patterns. Statements from people close to you." I felt something cold settle in my chest. So they make me look incapable until I am on paper. Yes. And then they could petition for control, financial, medical, living arrangements. I exhaled slowly. There it was. Not imagination, not exaggeration, a real threat. "But," Margaret continued, leaning forward slightly, "only if you let them get ahead of you." I met her eyes. "I don't intend to." A small smile appeared on her lips. "I was hoping you'd say that." What followed wasn't panic. It was strategy. Clear, structured, controlled. We discussed everything: documents, accounts, authority, medical evaluations. Every piece of my life that could be turned against me and how to secure it. "You need proof," she said. "Not just that you're capable, but that you're aware." "I am aware," I replied. "Good," she said. "Then we make that visible." By the time I left her office, I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was preparing. The second step came quicker than I expected. That afternoon, Daniel called. "Hey, Mom," he said casually. Too casually. "I was thinking of stopping by later. Fix that loose cabinet hinge." There was no loose hinge. "Of course," I said warmly. "I'd love that." I could almost hear Elena in the background. Always just out of sight. Always just present enough. "Great," he said. "We'll be there around 6.
We.
"Of course." I hung up the phone and smiled faintly. Right on time. If they were moving forward, I needed to do the same. But not by resisting. By allowing. That was the key. That evening, I prepared dinner as usual. Nothing extravagant, but thoughtful.
Familiar.
The kind of meal that said home, safety, routine. When they arrived, I greeted them with the same warmth I always had.
No tensión. No suspición. No confrontación.
If anything, I softened slightly. Played into it. "Victoria, You didn't have to cook, Elena said, stepping inside, her eyes scanning the room quickly. I wanted to, I replied. It keeps me busy.
I saw it then.
That flicker. Approval. Dinner passed easily. Too easily. They watched me, not obviously, but carefully, waiting for mistakes, for slips, for confirmation. So I gave them something else. Small hesitations, a misplaced word, a slight pause before answering a simple question. Nothing dramatic, just enough. And they noticed. Of course they did. After dinner, Daniel moved toward the kitchen. I'll check that cabinet, he said. Thank you, I replied. I followed more slowly, stopping just short of the doorway. And that's when I heard it again. Quieter this time, but clear. She's getting worse, Elena whispered. Daniel didn't answer right away, but when he did, yeah, he said quietly. I see it too. I closed my eyes for a brief second, not in pain, in confirmation. Then I stepped into the kitchen, smiling gently. Did you find the problem? I asked. Daniel turned quickly. Yeah, just a loose screw. Of course. Always something small. Always something just enough. That night, after they left, I didn't sit in silence. I acted. I wrote everything down. Every word. Every look. Every moment. Not as memory. As record. Because memory can be questioned. Documentation cannot. Then I picked up my phone and sent Margaret a message. They've started. Her reply came quickly.
Good.
That means we're right on time. I placed the phone down and looked around my house. My home.
Still mine.
Still standing. And now, protected. Because they thought they were guiding the situation. That I was slowly slipping into something helpless. But they didn't understand something very important. I wasn't slipping. I was stepping. Carefully. Deliberately. Into position. And once I was ready, I wouldn't just stop them. I would make sure they never tried again. By the third week, the pattern became undeniable, not just to me, but to anyone who knew how to look beneath the surface. Daniel and Elena had shifted from subtle concern to quiet management. It was no longer just comments or suggestions. It was presence. Frequent, deliberate, almost scheduled. They began stopping by every other day, sometimes with food, sometimes with tools, sometimes with nothing but polite smiles and watchful eyes. And I welcomed them every single time. That was the part they didn't expect. Most people, when cornered, resist. They argue, deny, push back too early, too emotionally. But resistance would only feed their narrative. If I fought them now, they would call it confusion, instability, proof. So instead, I gave them something far more dangerous. Agreement. Maybe you're right, I said one afternoon, standing in the kitchen as Elena reorganized my shelves without asking. It has been harder to keep track of things lately. She paused, just for a fraction of a second, then resumed her movements, but I caught the shift in her posture. Satisfaction. Yes, she said gently, too gently. It happens, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. Of course not. Not if it benefits you. Daniel, standing by the doorway, crossed his arms in that thoughtful way he'd adopted recently, like he was always analyzing something. We just want to make things easier for you, Mom. Easier. Another generous word. Another dangerous one. I know, I replied softly. And I meant something entirely different again. From that moment on, everything accelerated. They started bringing up options more frequently. Assisted living communities. Smaller homes. Safer environments. Always framed as concern, never as a decision already made, but the direction was clear. And I followed it. Carefully. I began to lean into the role they had already assigned me. I asked questions I didn't need answers to. Repeated stories I had told only once. paused mid-sentence, as if searching for words that were never lost. Nothing exaggerated, just enough to confirm their growing belief. And they were watching closely. Too closely. They didn't realize they were becoming predictable. Every reaction, every glance between them, every shift in tone, it all formed a pattern. And patterns can be studied, anticipated, used. One evening, I decided to take it further. I called Daniel myself. "Sweetheart," I said, letting just a trace of uncertainty slip into my voice. "I was thinking about what you said about the house." The silence on the other end was immediate. Then, "Yeah, Mom? I'm not sure I can manage it forever," I continued. "It's just a lot." That was all it took. They arrived within 30 minutes. Not subtle, not cautious. Hungry. Elena barely waited to sit down before she pulled out a folder, neatly organized, color-coded, prepared. "I've been looking into some really lovely places," she said, spreading brochures across my coffee table. "This one has a garden, a wellness center, even art classes." Art classes? How thoughtful. "How far is it?" I asked. "About 20 minutes, Daniel said quickly. "Close enough for visits." Visits. Scheduled, controlled, limited. I nodded slowly, as if processing. "And the house?" I asked. Elena and Daniel exchanged a glance. There it was again. That silent communication. "We would take care of everything," Elena said. "You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." I looked down at the brochures, letting a small sigh escape. That would be a relief. And just like that, they believed they had won. The shift in the room was immediate. The tension melted into something lighter, almost celebratory. Elena's shoulders relaxed. Daniel smiled, really smiled for the first time in weeks. They thought the hardest part was over. They thought I was giving in. But in reality, they had just stepped exactly where I needed them to. The next phase required precision. And patience. I began leaving things in plain sight. Not obvious, but intentional. A bank statement on the table, partially visible. Numbers just high enough to raise interest, but not so high as to seem unrealistic. A letter from a financial advisor, left unopened near the hallway. Notes written in my own handwriting referencing accounts, properties, decisions that didn't actually exist. And most importantly, I let them find it, not by handing it to them, but by allowing their curiosity to do the work. Elena was the first to take the bait. I noticed at the moment she stepped into the living room and her eyes landed on the envelope I had forgotten on the side table. She didn't touch it immediately, but she remembered it. Later, when I stepped out of the room for just long enough, it had moved. Slightly. Enough. That evening, I overheard them again. Different tone. Different energy. "This changes things," Elena whispered. "I didn't know she had that kind of money," Daniel replied. "Neither did I. Because it wasn't real."
But it didn't need to be.
It just needed to be believable. And now,
It was.
a few days later, Daniel brought it up directly. "Mom," he said carefully, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, "you've been handling everything on your own for a long time." "I have," I agreed. "But maybe it's time to get some help managing things. Just to be safe." Safe. Always safe. "What kind of help?" I asked. "Financial. Legal. Just to make sure everything is organized." I looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "That sounds reasonable." And there it was again. Relief. Not concern. Relief. Because in his mind, I was stepping exactly where he needed me to. What he didn't realize was that every step had already been planned. That night, I called Margaret. "They're fully invested now," I said. "Good," she replied. "That means they'll push faster." "They already are." "Then it's time," she said. Time. Such a simple word. But everything depends on when you act. Too early and you lose control. Too late and you lose everything. But right now was perfect. The meeting was set for the following week. I told Daniel that my advisor would be coming over to help organize my documents. He insisted on being there. Of course he did. Elena too. Of course. I agreed, without hesitation. And then, I made a few additional invitations, carefully chosen, precisely timed, because if they wanted to build a case against me, I would build one against them. And unlike theirs, mine would be undeniable. The night before the meeting, I walked through my house slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of tables, the frames of photographs. Not out of nostalgia, but out of recognition. This was still mine. Every inch, every memory, every decision. They had almost convinced me that I was losing control. But now I understood the truth. Control is never given. It is taken, or kept. And tomorrow, I would make that very clear. I paused by the window, looking out into the dark street.
Calm. Still.
Unaware. Just like them. They believed they were guiding me toward an ending. A quiet, manageable, convenient ending. But what they didn't understand was that I had already rewritten it. And in my version, I wasn't the one being moved. I was the one moving everything. I turned off the lights and headed upstairs. For the first time since Christmas, I felt something close to anticipation. Not fear. Not anger. Something sharper. Satisfaction. Because the illusion was complete. They thought they were in control. And tomorrow, I would let them see just how wrong they were. The morning of the meeting arrived with a stillness that felt almost unnatural, as if even the house understood that something irreversible was about to happen. I woke before my alarm, not from anxiety, but from clarity. There was no hesitation left in me, no lingering doubt about what I was doing. Everything had been prepared too carefully, too deliberately for second thoughts to have any place now. I moved through my routine with precision. Coffee, a light breakfast, a final review of the documents Margaret and I had assembled. Every paper had its place, every detail its purpose. This was no longer a reaction. This was execution. By noon, the living room was ready. The table was set with quiet intention, neat stacks of folders, a pen placed exactly in the center, my reading glasses resting beside them. Nothing excessive, nothing theatrical. Just order.
Control.
I chose my outfit with the same care as before, something simple but firm in presence. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was reminding them, visually unmistakably, that I was still fully here. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Right on time. I opened the door to find Daniel and Elena standing side by side, both dressed more formally than usual. It was almost amusing. They looked like they were attending a negotiation, not a family discussion. Daniel gave me a quick smile, but his eyes were already scanning past me, searching for signs, documents, people, anything that might give him an advantage. Elena, on the other hand, wore confidence like a second skin. Controlled, poised, already certain of the outcome. "Mom," Daniel said, stepping inside. "You look great." "I feel great," I replied calmly. Elena walked in behind him, her gaze moving subtly across the room, taking in the setup. "This looks very organized," she said. "I thought it would help," I answered. We sat down, and for a few moments, everything was almost polite. Too polite. The kind of quiet that stretches thin, waiting for someone to break it. Elena was the one who did. "So," she said, opening her folder, "we brought some updated information about the residents we discussed. There's still availability, but we may need to act quickly." Of course. Always urgency. Always pressure disguised as opportunity. I nodded slowly. I understand. Daniel leaned forward, his hands clasped together. And about your documents, we can go through everything together, just to make sure it's all in order. There it was again, that careful wording, that quiet attempt at control. I'd like that, I said. And I meant it, because what they didn't know was that everything was already in order.
Just not in the way they expected.
A few minutes later, the doorbell rang again. Daniel frowned slightly. Are we expecting someone else? Yes, I said, standing up. We are. When I opened the door, Margaret stepped in first, composed and professional as always, followed by two others, Dr. Harris, my physician, and Mr. Caldwell, a retired judge Margaret had asked to be present. Their arrival shifted the entire atmosphere instantly. The room that had felt like quiet manipulation just moments ago now carried weight.
Authority.
Witness. Daniel stood up, confusion turning quickly into unease. Mom, what is this? Support, I said simply. Elena's expression tightened, but she recovered quickly. I don't understand why this is necessary. Margaret stepped forward before I could respond. It's necessary because we're discussing matters that involve legal and medical implications. It's best to have clarity.
Clarity.
Such a powerful word. We all took our seats again, but this time the balance had changed. Daniel and Elena were no longer guiding the conversation. They were reacting to it. I folded my hands calmly on the table. Let's begin, I said. Margaret opened the first folder, her movements precise. Victoria recently underwent a full cognitive evaluation, she began, nodding toward Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris adjusted his glasses slightly. Her results show no signs of cognitive impairment. Memory, reasoning, decision-making, all within normal and healthy ranges for her age. The silence that followed was immediate, sharp. Elena shifted in her seat. With all due respect, she said carefully, we've observed behaviors that suggest otherwise. I turned my head slightly toward her. Like what? I asked. She hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Daniel stepped in. You've been forgetting things, Mom. Repeating yourself. Leaving things unfinished. Or, I interrupted calmly, reacting exactly as someone would after being subtly manipulated for weeks. That stopped him.
Completely.
I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady, clear, controlled. I heard you, Elena. At Christmas. In the hallway. Her face drained of color. Daniel froze. I heard everything. I continued. The plans. The discussions. The assumptions about my future. No. Daniel started, but his voice lacked conviction. Yes, I said firmly. And since then, I've been paying attention. To everything. Margaret slid another folder across the table. Victoria has documented multiple instances of behavior that suggest intentional influence, she said. Rearranging medications, creating confusion, reinforcing narratives of decline. Elena's composure cracked. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You're twisting things. No, I said quietly. I'm revealing them. I reached for the final folder. And then, I added, allowing just the slightest hint of calm satisfaction into my voice, there's this.
Daniel stared at it.
The Florida property, he said slowly. The investments, Elena added, almost under her breath. I smiled.
Small.
Measured. There is no Florida property, I said. Silence. Heavy. Complete. No investments you didn't already know about. No hidden accounts. That was the test. Their faces changed in real time.
Shock.
Then realization. Then something deeper. You lied? Daniel whispered.
I adapted. I replied.
To the situation you created. Margaret leaned forward. This demonstrates intent. on both sides. Mr. Caldwell, who had remained silent until now, spoke for the first time. His voice was calm, but carried undeniable authority. If this had continued, he said, it could have escalated into a very serious legal matter. Daniel's shoulders dropped. Elena looked away. For the first time since I had known her, she had nothing to say. I took a slow breath, then stood. This ends today, I said. My voice didn't rise.
It didn't need to.
I am not incapable. I am not confused. And I am not leaving my home. Daniel looked up at me, something fragile breaking through his expression. Mom, I love you, I said, softer now, but no less firm. But what you are willing to do, that doesn't disappear. Elena remained silent, and that silence said more than anything else could. I looked at both of them, and for the first time, I wasn't reacting to them. I was defining the boundary. You will not make decisions for me, I continued. You will not question my capacity without cause. And you will not treat me as something to be managed. No one argued, because there was nothing left to argue. The truth had already settled. The illusion had already shattered. After a moment, Daniel stood slowly. We should go, he said quietly. Elena followed without a word. When the door closed behind them, the house fell silent again. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. Not tense, not uncertain, resolved. Margaret looked at me with a small, approving smile. You handled that perfectly. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight finally lift. No, I said quietly. I finished it. And for the first time in months.
I truly meant that.
Time doesn't fix things the way people like to believe. It doesn't magically erase betrayal or restore trust as if nothing ever happened. What it does, quietly, persistently, is reveal what's real and what was only ever an illusion. In the weeks that followed that afternoon, my house didn't feel empty. It felt honest. There was no more careful watching, no more hidden conversations, no more subtle shifts in tone meant to make me doubt myself. The silence that settled into my home wasn't loneliness. It was clarity. Daniel didn't call. Not the next day. Not the next week. And Elena, well, her absence was absolute. At first, I noticed the quiet in practical ways.
No sudden visits.
No unnecessary help. No rearranged cupboards or misplaced items that made me question my own memory. Everything stayed exactly where I left it, and that alone told me more than any apology could have. For years, I had built my life around being needed, around being available, around making sure everyone else felt supported, stable, secure. It had never occurred to me that in doing so, I had slowly allowed my own independence to become negotiable in their eyes. Not anymore. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it exist. I let myself exist within it. Mornings became slower, but not empty. I sat with my coffee longer, not because I had nothing to do, but because I no longer felt the pressure to rush into someone else's needs. I began walking again, real walks, not just quick errands. Around the neighborhood at first, then further, rediscovering places I hadn't paid attention to in years. There was a small park 3 blocks away I had driven past countless times but never entered. Now I did. And I sat there one afternoon, watching children play, listening to conversations that had nothing to do with me, and realized something simple but powerful. My life was still mine, not something to be transferred, managed, or reduced.
Mine.
I started making changes, not drastic ones, not emotional ones, intentional ones. I updated my documents with Margaret properly this time. Everything clear. Everything protected. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. I had learned something I couldn't unlearn. Security isn't about expecting trust. It's about preparing for the moment it breaks. I also did something I hadn't done in years. I reached outward. Not to family, but to people. Real connections, not obligations. I joined a local art class, something I had once loved but abandoned somewhere along the years of responsibility. The first day felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, like stepping into a version of myself I hadn't seen in decades. But by the third session, I found my rhythm again. Color,
Shape.
expression without explanation. No one there saw me as someone declining. No one questioned my capability. I was simply,
Victoria.
and that felt like freedom. Weeks turned into months. Then one morning, 3 months after everything had happened, I found an envelope in my mailbox.
Handwritten.
I knew the handwriting immediately. Daniel. I didn't open it right away. I brought it inside, placed it on the table, and sat down across from it. Not avoiding it, just respecting the moment. Some things deserve space before they're faced. When I finally opened it, there were no long explanations.
No excuses.
No attempts to rewrite what had happened. Just honesty. I was wrong, not just in what I did, but in how I allowed myself to think. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want the chance to speak to you when you're ready. I read it twice. Then I folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. And I waited, not because I didn't know what I felt, but because I did. Forgiveness isn't immediate. Trust isn't automatic. And relationships, real ones, aren't rebuilt through words alone. 2 weeks later, I called him. Let's meet, I said simply. We chose a small cafe, not my house, not his. Neutral ground. No history in the walls. No emotional advantage. When I arrived, he was already there. He looked different. Not older, exactly, but quieter, more aware. Hi, Mom, he said, standing up. Hello, Daniel. We sat down, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he did something I didn't expect. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He took responsibility. I let things go too far, he said. And I didn't stop it when I should have. I watched him carefully, not judging, not softening, just listening. Elena pushed the idea, he continued, but I agreed. And that's on me.
There it was.
The truth. Simple. Uncomfortable.
Real.
And now? I asked. He hesitated, then answered honestly. We're not together anymore. That didn't surprise me. Not because I had predicted it, but because once something like that is exposed, it rarely stays contained. I've been trying to understand how I got there, he said. How I started seeing you as something to manage instead of someone to respect. I held his gaze. And have you figured it out? Part of it, he admitted.
Fear.
Pressure. And convenience.
Yes.
That word again. Convenience. It ruins more relationships than anger ever could. We talked for a long time that day. Not to fix everything. Not to erase anything. But to understand. And that made all the difference. I don't expect things to go back to how they were, he said at one point. They won't, I replied calmly. And that was the truth. Because what we had before wasn't as strong as I once believed.
It had gaps.
Blind spots. Assumptions. What we had now was something new. Something more careful. But also more real. If there's a way forward, he said quietly, I'm willing to take it. However long it takes. I considered that. Not emotionally. Not impulsively. But honestly. There is a way forward, I said. But it's not built on what we had before. He nodded. I understand. And for the first time since everything happened, I believed him. Rebuilding didn't happen all at once. It wasn't dramatic. It was gradual. Small conversations. Occasional meetings. Clear boundaries. I didn't invite him back into my life fully. I allowed him to earn his place in it again. And he did.
Slowly. Consistently.
without pressure, without expectation. As for me, I didn't return to who I was before. I became someone better, stronger, not in resistance, but in awareness. Kinder, but not at the expense of myself. Open, but not unprotected. One evening, months later, I stood in my living room, looking around the space that had nearly become something else entirely. A transaction, a transition, a loss. Instead, it remained what it had always been.
A choice.